Ed Gein, the Ghoul of Plainfield, Wisconsin. In this podcast, I will be going over the story of grave robber and murderer Ed Gein. Together, me and you are going to go through his life and see if he really was a serial killer. We will find out whether or not he was just a grave robber who murdered twice or maybe 3 times in his life, or if he was a crazed murderer who killed 8 people, including young girls. Ed Gein was born into a matriarchal family. The only time his father showed any power was when he beat his wife and children while in a drunken rage. His father, George Gein, only married his mother Augusta because his father had no family, while Augusta had a very large one. Augusta either married George because at first look he was strong and dignified, or she knew he was actually a very insecure man and would bend to her will, and she found that attractive. We don't really know why, but all we do know is that they had 2 sons, Henry and Edward Theodore Gein. Some important things to note about the family is that George was usually out of a job because he was not a hard worker. Augusta had to open a shop to keep the family fed. Augusta was an extremely devout Lutheran. Besides that, she had some of her own views on sex, marriage, and the faults of both men and women. To be clear, she thought that sex was filthy and the only use of it was procreation. She never divorced George because she couldn't, and that men were filthy beasts and that women were whores, whose only job nowadays was to tempt honest men into cheating on their wives. Augusta made a vow to raise her children different, so that they wouldn't turn out like normal men. So to ensure that they would turn out pure, she decided to sell the shop and buy a farm out in the country, where her sons would never be tempted by women. But, unfortunately for Augusta, Edward Theodore Gein had to attend Rocha Cree and later the White School, where he would finish his high school education at the age of 16. In school is where he got his first signs of being socially awkward. He just wasn't able to fit in with his classmates no matter how hard he tried. Ed Gein's father, George Gein, died when he was 66 in 1940. This isn't really important because the only impact their father had on Henry and Eddie's life is when he impacted them with his fist. When World War II broke out, Henry was too old for military service, but Ed was of the right age, so he traveled farther than he ever would from his hometown to Milwaukee for a physical exam. But due to a growth on his eye, he was deemed unsuitable for military service. After the death of their father, the Gein brothers went out into town looking for work. Out in the town, they were fairly well liked. Even though they weren't the most social men, Ed especially, they were hard workers, polite, and for the most part, dependable. This is the moment of Edward Gein's first suspected kill. Also, this shows how much Augusta held power over Ed. When Henry suggested that Edward might be too much of a mama's boy, it caused a rift between the brothers because Edward held his mother above all other people. According to Edward, his brother decided that they should go burn off some dry grass. While they were burning the grass, a strong wind suddenly picked up and started blowing the fire out of control. After working hard to put the fire out, it had turned dark, and Ed just couldn't find his brother. So he went and got a search party. However, with the search party in tow, he had no trouble finding the unburned Henry, with some funny-looking bruises on his head. People eventually came up with the answer that Henry either had a bad heart or that he died from asphyxiation from the smoke. But one thing for sure is that Eddie Gein, the meek little man who lived on the hill with his mother, was definitely not at fault. This left Ed Gein the only man in the house with his mother, and this was probably just the way he liked it. But then, the worst moment of Ed Gein's life would happen. His mother, who was infallible as her heart was pure, who could never do any wrong and was stronger than any person in the world, suffered a stroke and had to be taken to the hospital. Now, Ed is a fairly messed up man, even though he was terrified at the mortality of his mother. This was also the chance for her to finally see how good of a son he was. She might even compliment him. However, she didn't even give him a single good job. She didn't even let him help her walk again. Thankfully, her time on Earth was not much longer. She died after seeing a man with a woman who was not his wife. and her feeble and pure heart could just not handle the sheer sinfulness. As a testament to her character, only some of her family showed up, and no one else. After her death, Ed kept living life and made money by getting hired out as a general worker, being a handyman, or babysitting children. He liked reading, as it was much better than the world he was currently lived in. This is fairly normal, right? Just a little bit of escapism from the big scary world. What he was reading was the problem. Edward Theodore Gein, the future gravedigger and suspected serial killer, liked to read stories about Nazi barbarities, and not just Nazis killing Jews in prison camps. He especially liked stories about Nazis who especially enjoyed their jobs, and in one particular, enjoyed making lampshades out of the skins of her victims. However, Gein wasn't just interested in Nazis. He's got a more refined palate of reading about head-hunting cannibals and sexual mutilation. Now, around the time of Gein losing his one true love, his commanding mother, some disappearances happened. In total, 6 people went missing, including Mary Hogan, a bar owner who just happened to live in Pine Grove, 7 miles from Plainfield, and who just happened to have an unmistakable resemblance to a certain woman named Augusta. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Ed Gein killed her. He shot her with a .32 caliber round and dragged her body to his pickup truck, where he then took off with it. How do we know what caliber Ed used? He left the shell casing. It's not his fault. It has been proven that he has a below-average intelligence. Also, a man named Elmo Ueck, who sometimes hired Ed, said that if Ed spent more time courting Mary, she'd be cooking for you instead of being missing. Being the genius serial killer Ed is, he said, "She's not missing, she's down at the house now." But because Ed is a weirder loner and says stuff like this sometimes, Elmo didn't think much of it. But this wasn't just Ed getting lucky. Whenever her disappearance came up in conversation, he was saying the same joke. Besides being unoriginal and not using new material, it was not exactly the work of the average psychopath. Joke was, "She's at the farm right now. I went and got her in my pickup truck and took her home." Like I said before, he has a below average intelligence. It's not his fault. His next and last kill was a woman named Mrs. Warden, who also unfortunately looked like the most beautiful woman in the world, Augusta Gein. Mrs. Warden owned a shop, much like how Mary Hogan owned a bar, and Augusta owned her own shop. One day, while her son Frank was out hunting, Ed Gein, who had asked if Frank would be out hunting yesterday, came in to get some antifreeze. She filled up the jug, he paid for it, and walked out the door. Then he came back in to trade his rifle out for another one, and asked to look at the gun on the wall. While the absolutely harmless Ed Gein looked over the rifle, Warden went to the front of the store and looked out the window. While she was looking away, Ed shot her in the back of the head with a bullet he had hidden in his pocket. Then he loaded her body into his pickup and raced home, past Elmo, who was going down the same road. Ed Gein then went to his neighbor's house for dinner. While Ed was out at dinner, Frank had come back to the store to find a very large amount of blood. He contacted the police and told them who killed his mother, Ed Gein. It was obvious who had killed her. Ed had been hanging around the store a lot lately, which, unlike a bar, is a little suspicious. Frank could also remember that Gein was always trying to get his mother to go out on a date with him, and that Gein had asked if Frank was going hunting the day of his mother's murder. But the thing that really sealed the deal was the receipt for Gein's antifreeze. Yep, Ed left his receipt, a piece of evidence, literally with his name on it. The police caught up to Gein at his neighbor's The Hills house and caught him in the driveway. Officer Dan Chase asked Gein to please go through the events of the day, then asked him to do it again. Gein, being the genius serial killer he is, didn't give the same story he just did moments ago. Then, when he was called out on this, to show his undeniable intelligence, said he was framed for something he really shouldn't have known about. To cut a long story short, the police found the mutilated bodies of 11 women in his house. 2 of them were Hogan and Warden. The rest were unknown at the time and were eventually found to be corpses from various cemeteries around Plainfield. Oh yeah, I might have forgotten to mention something about Gein's reading habits. Gein loved to read newspapers for stories about Nazis and cannibalism, which was very rare to occur in a newspaper, and he loved to read the obituaries. And he wasn't just reading, he was looking for something. By something, I mean someone. And by someone, I mean an older, enterprising woman who reminded Gein of his mother. If he found one, he would go dig them up and take them to his house, where he would make death masks and cut off their genitals. Now it is time to talk about the trial of Edward Theodore Gein. To again cut a big story short, Gein was found insane and pleaded innocent by way of being insane. He was found unfit to stand trial until 1968, when he was found fit to stand trial and was found guilty of the murder of Mrs. Wharton. But since he was insane, he was just put into an asylum, where he grew old and fat and eventually died. Some other things of note is that the trial made Plainfield very famous, which the townspeople were very unhappy about. Also, Gein acted very compliant and was even somewhat happy with the attention he was getting. However, he was never allowed to say anything to the news, even though they tried really hard to interview him. Now that his story is done, we know the facts, let's talk about what he did or didn't do. Let's start with the obvious stuff. Gein was found guilty of the murder of Mrs. Wharton, and Hogan's body was found in his house. So unless he just found it in a ditch, after the murderer, who used the same murder method that was used on Wharton, left it there. A slight dip into the non-obvious would be the death of his brother. At the time of the murder, people just thought it was a fairly strange occurrence, but once the trial started, the people of Plainfield started thinking of it as a Cain and Abel type event. In my opinion, that Gein killed his brother because his brother insulted Gein's closeness to his mother. He had a reason and a means to do it. Let's talk about Gein's other suspected victims. They are the 8-year-old Georgia Weckler, 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley, 1-year-old Janice Rasmussen, and 2 middle-aged hunters, Victor Travis and Ray Burgess. Right off the bat, you might notice that 2 of the suspected murders were men. The only male victim Ed has is probably his older brother, and that was only because he had a grudge against him. In all honesty, Gein is terrible at murder. He's shorter than the average man, he's probably weaker too, and his mother didn't look like a middle-aged man. I don't think Gein could have killed these 2 if he wanted to, and which he really didn't have a reason to. The investigators of that case probably just wanted to have all the murders in the area tied up in one big Ed Gein, the Ghoul of Plainfield, Wisconsin, shaped bundle. For the 3 young girls, one reason he is a suspect is because due to the faces and genitals shrinking, due to the lack of moisture, the bodies Gein dug up appeared to be smaller, and investigators jumped to the bit, trying to get closure on those cases as well. However, due to DNA testing, people figuring out that the parts just shrunk, he was found to not have those girls in his house. Of course, this doesn't mean Gein didn't do it, but most of his victims were brought back. I'm going to go over the cases of the young girls, and you should look for any of these matching Gein's usually murder tactics of shooting them in the head, and then putting them in his pickup truck. Georgia was dropped off from school by a neighbor at the end of the half-mile lane leading to her house. After the neighbor left, a black sedan was seen leaving that same lane shortly after. Both Evelyn and Janice were taken in the same event. Evelyn was babysitting Janice, and when she failed to notify the parents by phone as she usually does, the father of Janice drove to his house to discover both of the girls missing, along with some blood in the house and leading out the basement window. In both cases, no body was ever found. We know that if Gein took a body, he tended to keep them, and none of the bodies at the house matched the 3 young girls. Gein does not own a black sedan and doesn't like young girls. Gein's only known victims, including his grave robbing victims, resemble his mother. People believe that Gein both loved and hated his mother. To sum things up, in my opinion, the only people Gein killed are his brother, Mrs. Wharton, and Miss Hogan. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you would like to learn more about Ed Gein, the book Deviant by Harold Schechter goes into a lot more detail than I did. I only covered his life up to the murders and whatever I thought was important to who he did or didn't kill. This podcast took a lot of information from Deviant as it was my main source. See ya.